I'm delighted to welcome you all to the British Council Literature Seminar 2015, which is jointly organised by us, the British Council, and our partners from the Centre for British Studies at Humboldt University.
Main players and beneficiaries are, we hope, and we have seen it happening in the past 30 years, the writers, the participants, readers all, but also translators, editors, and academics with a professional and personal interest in what is happening in contemporary British literature.
I tried to gather a few questions under the heading of form intention, which you will already have seen. I don't think we're here to answer those questions. I think we're here to travel them, really. We're very much here not as commentators or theorists or cultural observers, but people who write books. And that's the approach we'll be taking is that of the practitioner rather than the theorist. I'm always struck by how, when writers try to describe what it means to find form and to gather material into something that becomes work, how physically they describe it, how material their analogies are. A panorama for and of my father, paths of chalk and water, the perpendicular highways of night creatures, ridged contours and jackknife shadows, cropped growth on compacted slopes, the press from above and below, unreachable fields where light is deflected, pearled and pooled so that it just hangs there. Things start collecting, particularly with poems. I'm not somebody who thinks of a group of poems. You just put them in a drawer and then they start talking to each other and then you start listening. But then suddenly you hit a phrase, and I don't know where I know where the Casual Perfect came from because it's a quote, but the built moment just came up in a line when I was working on that, and I just knew that it's captured what I was trying to do, or it was the pivot. I think really of titles as pivots around which everything can move.
And a big black gate opened up at the other end. In swam Ramu, our other performer, an orca, a killer whale, the apex predator, the most successful animal in the world's oceans, present in every ocean, in fact. Incredibly social, incredibly organized, incredibly intelligent. A wild, proud swimming animal with the tallest dorsal fin of any of the cetaceans, 2 meters high, scything through the seas of the Arctic or the Indian or the Atlantic Ocean, the signifier of this sea wolf, this extraordinary animal. But Ramu, our other performer, his dorsal fin had flopped like a detumescent sign of his captivity. A pathetic signal, really, of the whole scenario that was being presented to us, the circus that we were being presented with. And then, of course, inevitably, Ramu jumped through a hoop, balanced a ball on his nose, and caught fish in his beak. That was my moment of apostasy. That was when I grew up. That was when I realized how shit the world was. And that's when I fell out of love with these animals because I couldn't do anything about it. And the whale now is so close I could easily touch it. I could have easily reached out and touched it. But that wasn't part of the encounter. And after all, generally you don't poke people the first time you meet them, do you? She turned on her side and she was right next to me and she looked at me with an eye the size of a grapefruit, kind of visibly small in comparison to the size of the animal and the way that an elephant's eye is visibly small. But it was utter sentience. It was utter knowingness. It was utter curiosity. Yeah, I can never deny that. And I started to feel, I didn't hear, I felt through my skull, through my sternum, through the whole of my skeletal structure, the whale's echolocation, which it used down there in the darkness to find its food, or used to talk to its fellow whales, moving through me like an MRI scan. And I've been in an MRI scan. It's a very similar process, creating a three-dimensional sound picture of me, which is being beamed back to its head. I feel that. I feel the meanness of me being generated in this sound image back in her head. And it was the most extraordinary moment in my life.
And then they revealed that solids were not solid, that a wall was not solid, that it consisted of molecules fixed and vibrating some distance apart, as did the flesh. That solidity was really the likelihood of stuff not falling between two chairs, down the gaps, and that walking through the wall was not impossible, that it could be like slipping between pine trunks into a forest, which had looked from the road impermeable, but was where something lived. I'm interested in the way that poetry means, to put it very simply, poetry means many, many different things at once. And if you wrote a scholarly article that meant many, many different things at once, you'd probably get it back with notes from the readers at the journal saying, clarify this, clarify this. So that sense of poetry sending lights in many different directions and casting many different kinds of shadows and being truthful in the sense of Adrienne Rich's idea of truth, which is an increasing complexity, rather than truthful in the terms of being factual, I suppose.
I just think novels are probably quite a nice place between public and private, like they're semi-private, like especially now. I think you could write a novel and, you know, fewer people would read it than if you tweeted, probably. So people have to come and meet you in this little place that's called a novel, and I think that kind of appeals to people. So you're not entirely alone, but maybe you'll have 5 or 6 people come. I do ramble, but in different ways, like in different stories. So sometimes I just very briefly drop people into a situation, but sometimes I build up into it and blah, blah. I know everything is in there from the beginning. So it's not that it emerges, it's only perceived as emerging. That's the only way that I can explain it. To me, who is writing it, it's all in there. And so you can't stop, you can't stop something from emerging when it was already going to do that. So it was always going to have meaning. It just took a while. Why can't novels just change? Why does it?
Well, because a literary form exists in relation to its social and material existence, and the platform for the novel is the Codex. It's not the text, it's actually the physical book. Because there's no necessity for things to take the form of a volume in digital form. And indeed, young people are increasingly not reading books in that way. It'll carry on the novel form, but it's going to be like classical music or poetry.
Yeah, can I just pursue my analogy? The novel maybe is venerable, and like all, it's relatively venerable for a cultural form. It's not that old. It's only really, a couple of 100 years old. So it's not that old. About the same age as the symphony, actually, which is a form that I think it's very close to. I don't think it's going to die out altogether, partly because of the extended lifespans that people are all enjoying at the moment with concomitant problems, like a crisis in care homes. The novel will probably live on in its care home for quite a long time, sopping up its children's capital and, requiring a lot of social care. But I don't think it's going to die just yet. I mean, it's a great form, and the symphony hasn't died, but it no longer has real cultural centrality in that way. And I think that's all I'm saying, that in a wired and a web world, the novel cannot have cultural centrality. That's all.
I quite like to insert into a sentence, a very sort of flat sentence, a bit of panic. So when, right from the start, when Kitty Finch took her hand off the steering wheel and told Joe she loved him, he no longer knew if she was threatening him or having a conversation. So I introduced that idea of us being able to threaten each other with love, blah de blah. I had an idea for a short story here in Berlin because the hotel doors at the Alexander Plaza Hotel are glass and they're electronic. So everybody walks close up to them and they just open a little bit.
Yes. I thought that was personal. I thought that was just the doors didn't like me.
So then you realize that you have to step back. You have to be at a distance from them for them to open. And so, as Lavinia says, you know, I had a few goes going very close, but then I realized that they didn't want me to be so close. They didn't like this intimate relationship, and the only way they'd open is if I took 3 steps back. So I'm cooking up something about that, about distance and intimacy, and how I would work. That's absolutely a short story. That's not a novel. I have another short story to write about Schönefeld Airport and getting stuck there for 6 hours and going into the currywurst wagon and trying every currywurst there was for 6 hours, just a tiny little, you know. So that'll just be called Schönefeld Airport.